everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I am here with my old friend Adam, who is my often running partner, as well as I always forget. Did we meet because I interviewed you about one of your studies years ago?
Yeah, I took you to a terrible coffee shop that was really too loud and you couldn't record anything. So
That's right.
spent half an hour trying to find a better one.
Yeah,
We were stuck.
We were stuck. So Adam has written, this is number 3?
3.
Your third book, which is a book about what it means to get stuck and how to get unstuck. And it's really fascinating. And I thought, what I don't want to do is describe the whole book to you, because I don't want to diminish your incentive to buy it. But I thought there's all kinds of really fascinating topics that you touch on and that touch on this general subject that I want to get into. But I wanted to start a little bit about how did you come to this topic? Why is it?
So it started about 15 years ago. Maybe even 20 years ago. I was a graduate student and I was studying how people around the world perceive change. Mm-hmm. So we did this study where we gave people like 5 sunny days in a row and said, what's going to happen on day 6? Or, the economy's been doing badly for a month, what's going to happen next month? And what we found was that people in the West, people in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, they tended to say that what was happening was going to keep happening. People in the East Asia in particular, Japan, Korea, China, they tended to say, oh, obviously things are about to change. And so they were really open to the idea that things change and that they would have to pivot and be nimble and that things would shift around. And it made them much better prepared when they were stuck because they figured this was just a part of everyday life. People in the West, not so much. We were sort of blindsided by change. And that made us really badly prepared for it. And so I got interested in it 20 years ago.
Upon observing this difference, your immediate thought was that the Eastern way was better.
Yes. Because it's an accurate reflection of life. Like when you actually... So Bruce Feiler has this he's a writer and a very smart guy, and he has this work where he looked at people all around the United States and around the world, and he found that they have these things called life quakes, maybe 5 or 6 or 10 times a year. 10 times a lifetime, and then every 18 months or so they go through more modest periods of change. So he found that it was universal, that we were all going through these periods of change and constantly getting unstuck, and some of us unstuck again. And so to be expecting these periods of change was right. It was the right way to be.
How closely is I expect the world to change, the next day not to be sunny, and pessimism?
Well, it's both ways. So this can be good things too. So a lot of these life quakes were good things.
Yeah.
And in our studies, we said it had been raining for 5 days. What's going to happen tomorrow? And it's symmetric. So it's just this general sense in the East that things kind of bounce around a lot. And here we're sort of blindsided by any change, mostly bad, but also good.
Yeah. Now that, when you say one of those, that their view is closer to being accurate.
Yeah.
Do we have any idea about why they would have a more accurate view of tumultuousness of?
I think in the West, we have this sense that science has kind of allowed us to overcome a lot of the challenges in the world. And shifting away from mysticism and religion has meant that we feel that we have a lot of control. And I think that's less true in the East, where they still hew to some of these ideas that assume that there's going to be shifting and changing and balancing and things like that. So in that, I don't know that that's always true. I think obviously there's a lot of value in science. But I think in that sense, if you believe that science and medicine and so on help us do many things, then you start to feel like, in general, we have more control over things than maybe we do.
Wait, so you make this observation, so keep going. How does this lead you to thinking about writing a book about getting stuck and unstuck?
So, you'll know this about psychologists and people who do what I do. We always study the things that we're bad at. And so I went back to think about all the things that all the times I've been stuck and whether I've kind of been blindsided by them. And I feel that that's true, certainly about me. And I asked a few other people. I've now run this survey on thousands of people asking the same question. Like, when you get stuck, first of all, are you stuck? And people say, yes, in some respect right now I'm stuck. And then when you ask them, was that a shock? Mostly in the West they say, yes, it's a big shock. And I feel negative about it and I don't really know what to do about it. And that was 100% true about me. And so even 15, 20 years ago, I was thinking about that a lot. I wrote some research and started doing some research that was about topics around this thing, this idea. I remember we talked about one of them because we were talking about how people, when they have 9s at the end of their age, 29, 39, 49, we find that there's a huge rate in people signing up to run marathons. So it's like they stare down the barrel of the next decade.
The
you
abyss.
see this little spike. Yeah, I was 29 when I ran mine, so.
Yeah. Well, can you describe, for example, when you're using that word stuck, let's define what you're talking about.
Yeah. So it's not momentary. These are long-term things that are months, years, often decades, sometimes an entire life can be focused on the instance of being stuck. You have these stories of writers who spend 50 years between books, and it's the biggest thing in their lives. So I'm talking about big things, so that's the first characteristic. And then the second one is, I'm not talking about, say, March 2020, we're all stuck physically in place and there's nothing we can do and that's outside of our control. I'm talking about the majority of cases of stuckness where actually we have a lot of control. So, in the book and in general in my research, I've been very interested in how much control we do have when we get stuck. That idea that if you anticipate it, that's like 40% of the battle, 50% of the battle is in being sort of nimble and flexible in the face of being stuck. So it's long-term stuckness where we have control to shorten it, to lessen its severity, and to move past it.
But give me an example, for example, from your own life of when you felt you were stuck.
My undergraduate degree. So I was very lucky. I got a fellowship to study actuarial science in Australia, and I studied it for 6 months, and then the head of the fellowship came in to the lecture hall. I remember this really clearly, and he said, so if you are still here next week, we will assume that this is what you want to do with your life, and then if you quit after that, you have to pay back all the money we've been giving you. And so I was stuck. So I left. I left the degree, and I had no idea what to do next. And I had 6 months before I needed to sign up.
You made the decision to leave. So
yes.
But you were the stuckness was trying to figure out what happened afterwards.
What's next? Yeah.
And how long did that take?
I had 6 months. I had to figure out. In Australia, you don't just go to a university. You have to actually get into a degree at the university.
Yeah.
So I had 6 months, and they basically said to me, "Figure out what you want to do and spend some time." And so I was stuck. And so what I did was I went to, 50 introductory lectures in every imaginable thing that you can study. Like I went to philosophy and English and math and chemistry and law and everything that I could think of.
Oh, so you had a strategy.
I did. It took me a while to get there.
You weren't adrift.
I was briefly adrift.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the tide brought me back in, and then I figured out.
See, one of the issues I had, minor, with what is an otherwise wonderful book was, I don't buy it that you got stuck. From the outside, your life resembles that of someone who's the furthest thing from being stuck.
That's the thesis of the book, though. That for all of us, you perceive your own stuckness as way more easily than you perceive others. Everyone sees the finished product. I'm sure they feel that way about you too, and I'm sure there are things that they can't see. And for me, certainly, when I look at other people, unless I know them pretty well, I have no sense of all the things that were complicated leading them to where they are now. And I think that's a universal, right? And it's exacerbated in an age where you're sharing stuff online and other places. It's always the finished product. It's always the cream of the crop within whatever things you're doing with your life. And so that's magnified this process. But that's Tom Gilovich, who I know you know well, is a social psychologist at Cornell, has done a lot of work on this idea that hardships are very obvious to us, but in other people they're really invisible. But we always see other people coasting. You can always see when people are coasting. And I think that's part of the issue.
I find this sort of super interesting, that there's a kind of asymmetry.
Yeah.
That we perceive our own struggles clearly, but we're blind to the struggles of others.
Right.
But I'm not sure I entirely understand why. So is it not the case that when people struggle, they complain?
Sometimes they complain, but more often, because we're proud as a species, we complain to certain people. Mm-hmm. So you're more likely to know of the struggles of your very close friends. But in the world at large, especially looking further afield at the most successful people, who are the people who are written about and talked about, and they're the most prominent people who take up most of our mind space, we don't hear them complaining. We get to see the after effects for those people. And that's always the stuff that worked. The cutting room floor is invisible. You don't see the edits all along the way. You just see what the end product ends up being.
Yeah. Now, in what sense might that be a very useful bias?
I think it's very, in some senses, useful until you're stuck. So I think it's great. It's great when you're like, should I try this new thing? Should I take this risk? I think a lot of us look up at these people, and I teach business school students who are taking risks all the time, and they don't talk about the failures. They talk about the gargantuan tech companies and the success stories, and that's useful for them. That propels them. But as soon as they get stuck, they're like, why am I not Apple? Why am I not whatever?
Yeah.
And so I think it's very, very useful in getting started. I don't think it helps us once we're stuck.
Yeah.
And that's where you need a manual or a sense of how to strategize.
Because I've often heard it said that if entrepreneurs were rational, they would never be entrepreneurs.
Right.
Right, because the failure rate is so high, so you have to have a certain blindness at the outset. But your argument is the cost of that initial useful blindness is that if you hit an obstacle, it can be paralyzing and...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. Obviously, there's temperament involved there too. The kind of person who says, I'm going to take that risk, is more likely to persevere and not crumble at the first problem.
Yeah.
But I think our general sense that for other people the world is easy or easier is a problem for us when we get stuck. And I mentioned the survey I've been running. I've been running this on thousands of people around the world, and it's universal. You give people like 20 seconds and they'll say, oh yeah, I'm stuck, and here is what's going on for me.
Now, I wonder, I was thinking, and I said this to you backstage, I wanted to talk a little bit about our models of dealing with these kinds of difficulties. And the obvious model that we have in our lives are our parents. We observe, that's the principal adult that we're observing for the first 20 years of our life.
Right.
And I was thinking about one of the kind of canonical stories that my dad would tell was, actually, I take it back. It wasn't canonical. I think he only mentioned the story once, but maybe it's canonical for me. He said, he was a mathematician, and he said once, he would work on problems. And he said once, there was a problem that I got very engaged in when I was a graduate student, i.e. the 50s. And then he said, he was telling me the story in the 80s, 30 years later. Yeah. He goes, and I was gardening today, and the answer popped into my head. Right? Now, so he was technically stuck on that.
Yeah.
But the way he presented that story was it wasn't like he'd had a 30-year crisis.
Yeah.
He presented it as this enormous gift that imagination gives you, that it can spring the answer on you when you're pruning your roses 30 years after that. So and I'm wondering, so he had his strategy was, he had a certain narrative that he told himself to deal with his stuckness, so that it didn't seem pathological.
Did he say I was stuck? Was it something, because stuckness for me, it's an aversive state for most people, but I think if you're doing a 30-year-long math problem, it could be, if you're the right kind of person, and it sounds like he was, it could be really engaging. And he may not say I'm stuck, he might just say I'm in the midst of solving this problem. Mm-hmm. And there's this great theory. I remember one of the first things I learned as an undergrad in psychology was that if you're stuck on something, you've forgotten it, or you don't know what to do about it, just there's a little library in your head of all the things you know. Just send this little homunculus, this tiny little, that's Greek for little man, let him run around inside your head across the catalogs, and he'll keep checking stuff. Come back to him in a day and the solution will be there.
Does it say come back in 30 years?
Or come back in 30 years. He's going to be exhausted by then, but... But yes, that's the idea, that you can let these things go. And if you're okay with that, often just letting them be, giving them some space.
But I was wondering, but the reason I bring that up is that I'm wondering whether the word stuck is part of the problem here.
Yeah.
That by using, and we all use that word.
Yeah.
And you're using that word because you're describing a phenomenon that's instantly recognizable to all of us.
Right.
But I'm wondering if the problem starts with the fact that we are using a word that suggests that it's some kind of dire pathological condition, as opposed to just the normal course of events.
That's another argument, right? That this is not a glitch to be stuck. It is necessary and often produces great things. There's this amazing study that I talk about in the book. It's one of my favorite studies that I came across in studying this, and it's this study that shows that if you take an AI bot and people are trying to solve a problem, like something like an escape the room problem, like they're in little groups and they're trying to solve a problem, and the bot is an agent of chaos. It's meant to just throw all sorts of nonsense into the works. You'd think that would entrench you further. but this bot actually makes people solve the problem faster. So he's hindering them, but he's so random and just throwing so many question marks into the situation that he actually unsticks them. So they all think of themselves as kind of stuck, and his role, this little bot, I say his, it's not a he, but he's throwing question marks in and random.
Sure, bots are non-binary.
Probably.
Yeah, but you say they.
They were throwing in question marks, and that helped. And so I think a lot of how we perceive stuckness is it's totally subjective, and when you think you're stuck, sometimes you're not. And it's necessary to be a little bit stuck sometimes, as this bot made these people feel before the solution arrives. So especially in creative problems, like what you were talking about with your dad. Like we've focused on that so far. There are other kinds of stuckness. But I think in creativity, a lot of it is a sort of mindset.
Yeah. One of the things early in the book, when you're sort of framing the problem, you say the thing we have to remember when we get stuck is that everybody gets stuck.
Yeah.
And I wanted to dwell on that for a moment, because I'm wondering, is there a rare group of people who never do? And if so, what are they? Are they just simply expert users of all the strategies you describe, or are they just simply so good it never happens?
So there are people, I think there's an individual difference variable. Some people are unbelievably good at dealing with this. And so their periods of stuckness are really brief, and they treat them the way your dad did. They basically don't feel that they're stuck. And so they move past them quickly. The size of the stuckness is smaller and so on. So I think there are absolutely people who are like that. And a lot of them are in the book because I think their strategies of dealing with stuckness are amazing. But so much of it is luck. And it's still, I think, universal that you get faced with that situation. There are ways to move past it, but I think we all experience it to some extent.
Yeah. I thought of, in that wonderful, in Keith Richards' autobiography, he goes on at some length about Mick Jagger, of course. But one of the things he tells you about Mick Jagger is, and it is a kind of, you're sure that it's a kind of partially apocryphal telling, but Mick Jagger's great gift was his fluency. He would write all those lyrics for all those great Rolling Stone songs are written in a matter of, according to Keith Richards, minutes. He'd just go off and then he'd come back, and you think he'd just gone to the bathroom, but in fact he'd just written Wild Horses, and you're like, oh my goodness. But of course, and then you think, so just when you think, oh well, Mick Jagger is maybe this exception to the rule, and then you realize Mick stops writing songs 10 years into his career, and then what's he written since 1972?
Yeah, I mean, there are different arcs of stuckness, right? So there's the stuckness where I'm sitting at the computer and I can't figure out the next word, and then there's stuckness over 30 years that your dad experienced. And there are so many stories like Monet, Mozart, Einstein. They were all known for their periods of productivity, and then Einstein spent years where he lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. And Mozart had the same situation. Monet had the same situation at a certain point in his career. So it's not that you're always stuck, and some people are incredibly productive for certain periods. And some people are always productive creatively, and then interpersonally they have stuckness and other areas. This
is a weird question, but if Einstein spent such a long period of time lying on his back staring hopelessly into the ceiling, was it worth it?
Yeah, probably.
You think he would say, so if he had 10 brilliant years and then 30 years, it's funny, going back to my dad would always talk about, when he talked about Einstein, he would always talk about his dry spell, not his productive spell. Mm-hmm. He was weirdly fixated on the fact that Einstein gets obsessed with stuff that just doesn't pan out for years and years and years and years. But if you're Einstein, you suffered over the last...
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes after the productive period, it's different from coming before. Yeah. But Einstein talked a lot about the fact that he needed these fallow periods. They were critical to allowing his brain to reset and to get back into the swing of being able to tackle big problems. And so that was, I think, a really big part of it.
Would you take the Einstein trade-off? If I gave you 5 years of brilliance where you got E equals MC squared, but then you're going to be staring at the ceiling for the next 25 years, would you take it?
I would take 5 seconds of E equals MC squared brilliance.
You really would?
I mean, I think if you... So career-wise...
I would not.
Career-wise, if you're measuring a career and your peak is Einstein, that's pretty high. That's a pretty good peak.
No, but wait a minute, Adam. This is really interesting. So this is actually a really useful distinction between the way you and I think about the kind of cost of stuckness.
Can I stare at the ceiling while I'm not being Einstein the Brilliant?
No. Here's the deal. You get 5 years of record-breaking brilliance. You're going to win the Nobel. You're going to be remembered forever. You're going to be synonymous with genius. And then at the age of 27, it's over. You don't get anything else. Nothing else happens. You're
Like
fine with that.
In every area of my life?
No. In terms of your intellectual. So the thing that defines your genius is gone. Gone. You're fine with that.
I don't, if you rob me of that thing that defined my genius, I'd be unhappy. But if you said you're not going to do any more productive work, I think I'd find other things to do with myself. I think the height that he
So you
reached,
would be like, if you were Einstein, you'd just start a second career.
I'm sure he's fairly marketable as
You go to dentistry school and like, what did you do in your previous life, Dr. Einstein? Yeah.
He's got a few things he could point to. I'm sure he could find something else to do. I think that's also interesting, though, because the way you've described it, he's sort of told you're moving on, figure something else to do with yourself, which unsticks him. I think if you're stuck and you want to be Einstein over and over and over again beyond that 5 years, that would be torture. I think that'd be really tough. So George R.R. Martin, who's writing these Game of Thrones books, every time he's interviewed about them, he says, this is hell. Like, I don't even know what to do. I can't deal with this. People are asking me to write the next book. That sounds like a horrible way to live. But if you're told, okay, so you're not going to do that thing that brought you the Nobel anymore after age 27, there's something really liberating about that. I think.
But because what we're talking about, of course, is the great existential problem that faces every professional athlete.
Yeah, right. That's true.
Right? Is that they do get, we always interpret the ending of their careers in terms of physical decline, but it really is a kind of stuckness.
Yeah.
That they can no longer improve. Their enjoyment is clearly diminished. Their desire to do that thing starts to wane, and they really don't know what to do next.
100%. Yeah, it's a canonical example of that kind of stuckness that I'm talking about. The only thing that I think helps there is it's built into the career choice, right? So they know that what they're doing has an end date. They don't know exactly when it is, but when it arrives, it's not like a big mystery. Whereas for an Einstein who suddenly stops being Einstein, that's pretty tough.
Yeah.
So I think that might help a little bit, that they know that this is built into what they're doing.
This reading your book reminded me of one of my remedies is too strong a word. I periodically have ideas about how to fix higher ed, which I think is broken. And one of the things that's wrong with higher ed is the way that a university education is tied to youth. Mm-hmm. It's time limited. And it's age defined, is what I mean to say. Which is, if you think about the ubiquity of stuckness, makes zero sense.
Yeah.
Right? That the principal vehicle by which some portion of people can become unstuck is to go back to school.
Right.
Right? And yet, if we define school as something you do between 18 and 22, we've effectively closed the door on one of the best strategies we have for allowing people to reinvent themselves.
That's why I spent forever in grad school.
Yeah.
It's a great remedy for that reason, right? Grad school gives you another few years. If you do a PhD, maybe 5 or 6 or more years, and so it allows you to prolong that. And I think that base that you build makes you much more nimble later on. It gives you more options, at least.
Yeah.
The same way Einstein had lots of options at that point.
Sorry, this is a little tangent, but it's not impossible to design a set of social strategies around the ubiquity of this. And so on this general theme, why can't you have a social strategy that subsidizes people, mid-career people who want to go back to school? That strikes me as like, that the old phrase about youth is wasted on the young. Education is also often wasted on the young.
Yeah. And it's, I think, in some ways worse in Australia than here, because as a 17-year-old, I was told to forecast my career. Like, tell me, where do you want to go for college? What do you want to study? There's not even the same bridge between undergrad and grad school. There's no liberal arts. It's like, if you want to be a lawyer or a doctor, you tell us right now as a 17-year-old.
Yeah.
Which is problematic.
Yeah.
That's why we all end up shifting.
There was another idea in your book. By the way, the book is full of, there are so many tangents, digressions, little Easter eggs in this book. Another one that you spend a fair bit of time on that I want to talk a lot about is about the role of luck.
Yeah.
in getting unstuck. And that one of the reasons that we teach people to be persistent and have patience is that once you grant that luck plays such a large role in whether you're successful or not, or whether you get unstuck or not, then the longer you wait, the more likely you are to get lucky. Am I phrasing it accurately?
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And I think at the heart of the idea is there's a lot of research looking at careers retrospectively, like when was the best period in very talented people's careers and also less talented people. And some people have an amazing period in their 20s. The best period is in their 60s, 70s, 80s, some in the middle, some have 2 periods that are incredible. There's just a huge amount of variance, and we've been trying for such a long time to figure out what happened before those periods. Mm-hmm. Can you remake them? And we spent, a lot of researchers spent so long trying to figure that out that eventually they were like, I guess some of it's luck. And so you don't know whether you're going to have that great period around the corner. There are some things we know increase the chances, but so much of it seems to be driven by luck. And if you don't know when those things are coming, you just have to keep doing the thing, hoping that they'll be around the corner. And that's what luck is about.
Now, does building a stronger expectation, a stronger appreciation of the role of luck into your kind of life plan, is that liberating or is it confining?
I think it makes you humble in certain ways that are very useful. I remember when I was a grad student, it was when I was a grad student, Michael Lewis gave a talk at Princeton and said to all the students, by the way, you're all here because of luck, and he tried to make that argument. And I think what he was trying to do is to say, be humble, effectively, like you're very lucky. It's a very famous talk.
You should actually, I think, can you find it on? I'm sure it must be on YouTube.
It's there.
It's an unbelievably brilliant,
Yeah, there's a lot of silence during that talk.
Yeah.
And it's very effective, and I think it's true. And I think it can make you, it depends how you interpret it, but I think it makes you humble, but also there's something nice about the idea that if you keep trying, you will get there. I think that narrative generally is a popular one, and it's nice to have some evidence that if you keep trying, the more times you throw the dart at the dartboard, the more likely you are to succeed. That luck actually does play a reasonably big role.
But if we accurately appreciated the role of luck in our success, would that diminish or increase our, now I'm not talking about happiness now, I'm talking about our motivation.
Yeah.
Does it undermine motivation if you think that, the odds of me making it in my chosen field are 50% luck, 50% effort and talent? Does that make me less likely to work hard on my next book or more likely?
I don't think so, because I think the thing it doesn't talk about is how high are your peaks and how low are your troughs. So luck is about timing more than anything. When is the good stuff going to happen? Is it the beginning of the career? Is it the end? And the research says that there is a hot streak somewhere in everyone's career, which is a nice, hopeful idea. That in all careers, some of them don't rise to the same heights, but there's always going to be one somewhere. We just don't know where it is. But the reason you work and do this stuff is so that when it arrives, you take advantage of it, that it's as high as possible, that it lasts for as long as possible. So this is not very prescriptive about the nature of, not very descriptive about the nature of the peak and how long it'll last, but it tells you that there is a lot of luck in these careers. And people are not good at telling you why they had a hot streak when they did.
Why is that?
Because I think if it is luck, if luck's doing some of the work, it's kind of hard to perceive. It's not like one lightning bolt thing happened. It's a series of events. There is one thing that predicts it better than luck, though, which is you do two strategies in the right order. So the first strategy is you explore, the explore-exploit idea. You explore first, so this is what I was trying to do. I didn't realize it at the time, but sitting in all these different first-year lectures, and then you find the thing you like, and you say no to everything else, and you just do that thing. So these hot streaks come after you have this broad, I say yes to every opportunity approach, and then you start saying no to everything that isn't the thing that you're really focusing on. And Jackson Pollock had one of those in his career. He was trying every painting style, figured he liked the drip paintings, and then said, this is me for now, for a while. That's all I'm going to do. And Peter Jackson, the filmmaker, the same thing. He was making horror films and all sorts of other stuff, then did the Lord of the Rings fantasy stuff, and that was what he did, and that's all he wanted to do for a while.
Yeah. Now, I want to come back to that, but I want to just for a moment I'm still a little fixated on this luck thing. When part of the reason I wonder about, so sometimes you will ask a successful person why they're successful, and then they will say, I got lucky, right? And I think that they may mean that sincerely, but the listener often interprets that as the person saying, I can't explain it, or I don't want to tell you.
Yeah.
I wonder whether we have a kind of, there's something about us that is innately skeptical of that as an explanation for success.
I think we think it's the other person being humble a lot of the time.
Yeah.
If someone says I was lucky, it's trying to attribute externally, attribute the success to something external rather than internal, which I think is a way of saying it wasn't something I did strategically, which is a way of being a little bit humble, I think, a lot of the time. But that's the way I interpret it when I hear that. I think sometimes there's a specific event you can point to and you can say that was a lucky thing. But the thesis in the book is not just that there's luck, it's that there's also the ability to capitalize on it, to recognize it when it's happening.
Yeah.
So some successful people, when they say I was lucky, can then unpack that and say, this thing happened and I ran with it. There's a thing I do, I give this talk to freshmen sometimes where the argument in the talk is you should be exploring, so say yes to all the opportunities that arise. You can say no to other stuff later on, but as a freshman, say yes to everything because you don't know what you like yet. And in the course of showing that, I have these 4 emails in my past that I got that were emails where they sort of changed my life. Like it was an opportunity that was presented to me, and they were incredibly lucky. They weren't things that I had done to make them happen. And had I said no to those emails, this was early on in my career as a professor, if I'd said no to them, a lot of really good things would not have happened. So I think that's luck, and that was accidental. I said yes to those, so I was lucky that I was lucky. But I think you can be more strategic about it by just saying yes.
Yeah. I was reminded in Outliers, I have a chapter on Jewish lawyers and how I talked to all the sort of top Jewish lawyers in New York, and what was fascinating is they all had the same story. These were all, back then, men in their mid to late 70s, and they came of age as they all went to like NYU, and NYU was a commuter school, and City College for undergrad. And the only law you could practice if you were Jewish in New York in the 50s and early 60s was the law that the white shoe WASPy firms wouldn't touch, which was M&A and litigation. Mm-hmm. Those were the untouched, dirty, it was like the disreputable kind of law. So they're like, all right, they did M&A and litigation, and then lo and behold, 10 years pass, and that turns out to be what law is, right? Yeah, M&A and litigation. And it was very interesting because it's sort of a version of what you were talking about. They recognized that was lucky.
Yeah.
That there was this opportunity just sitting out there, and because of their closed-mindedness, the WASPy guys didn't want to touch what would turn out to be the 2 most lucrative areas of law.
Yeah.
But they had to exploit it. Like, they had an option of not going into law, right? They could have become dentists, but they're like, no, we'll do it anyway, whatever, we'll try it, right? So there's like that kind of, they presented, I think accurately, presented that career success as a function of qualified luck.
Yeah. I think a lot of the time that you have those stories where there's a constraint, like you can't do something and it liberates you a little bit. So being forced into an area of law, or there are a lot of stories of people getting unstuck or succeeding because they had fewer options, or because they didn't have to make this difficult decision, leaving behind all of these really attractive options that were on the table, part of the menu.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of people who I've found in interviewing them who are very successful, who got unstuck, Olympians, other people, often it was constraints that helped them. Like I couldn't use that style because of this weird thing with my shoulder, and so I learned a new way to do the backstroke and then became the fastest swimmer in the world. Those constraints tend to be very useful if you know what to do with them and if you've got a bit of grit and you move forward with them.
Walk me through what advice you would give to a young person if they wanted to construct a life where they could deal with getting inevitable stuckness in the best possible manner. So first of all, at what age would you start having this conversation? You have kids, so what age would you start to have conversations with them on this?
I think for young people in particular, this goes back a bit to my last book as well, it's really important that they don't think that what they see on social media, especially when they're young, is real, because that's the cream of everyone's crop. It's the very best 1% of everyone's life. And I think that's unbelievably uniquely damaging. I don't think we've had that exposure to the very best of everyone's situations, the kind of cleanness of everyone's lives, to compare our own messy lives to, I think is really damaging. So it's a really important place to begin, is to talk about, actually, that's not a real representation of what it is to be alive, to be a human. And so that's a good first place to begin. And I think setting up the expectation that things are going to be hard and exposing them to a little bit of hardship. There's a concept in the book, hardship inoculation, which is this idea that we get better at dealing with hardship with a little bit of earlier hardship.
What does that, be personal for a moment, in the context of your own children, what does introducing them to hardship mean?
Like watering the plants? Like, we're talking like low-level stuff at this stage. They're small.
We're talking about a guy who's living in Stamford, Connecticut at the moment, where it's hard to see hardship from the tree-lined streets of.
So I think like it doesn't have to be extreme hardship at this point when they're small, but like jobs and chores and all that sort of stuff, getting them to do things that are hard, or that if they perceive it as hard, that's good enough, right? So if a 5-year-old says, I don't want to do that, and you say you have to do it, and they do it, that's really good for them.
Yeah.
It sets them up for future hardships. Obviously, you can scale upward from there beyond age 7.
My almost 2-year-old daughter walk up the stairs every night to go to bed.
There you go.
And if she dilly-dallies, I yell at her, strong body makes a strong mind. Does that count?
That's perfect. That's. I'm going to put that in the revised prologue.
But so keep going. So a little bit of hardship inoculation, but I'm really interested in what this exploit thing means for a young person. Does that mean a lot of our strategies around undergraduate education, for example, are faulty?
I think liberal arts degrees and a broad-based education is great. I think it's a good thing. I think it's not the only thing you need, maybe, but I think it's a good place to begin because it keeps the options open and it's a good way to explore, to figure out what the different options are. So in that way, I think the US education system is stronger than the Australian education system that forces you into a pigeonhole really early. So I like that idea. But this is what that talk to the freshmen is about. It's about saying yes to everything for as long as possible until you absolutely are forced to commit to something. So you know at least what the options are.
Yeah.
It's like the online dating of the college majors world. Like you want to,
Yeah. This is an incredibly specific version of this, but doesn't it argue, for example, you really should take a gap year? You shouldn't rush into, because you're introducing a whole set of experiences that you almost certainly didn't have as a high school student.
Yeah.
And that would kind of further your and this deferring of like, I remember once, it was funny, all these things were brought up. While reading a book, I remembered all these things. I remember sitting in a cafe once and there were 2 girls next to me, and they were probably in 8th grade. They were having like a cup of tea together. And one of them was talking about how, they must have been younger than that. One of them was talking about how she wasn't good at math. And I came this close to turning her and saying, how do you know you're not good at math? You're 13. You don't know anything about what you're good at 13. Like, it just seemed like there was something about the world in which they were. And that is, by the way, a license for at some point getting stuck in your life because you've already closed off a door, an ability, a kind of pathway that might be really useful to exploit at some later.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the key to living life the right way, is knowing when to have that broad yes to everything thing and when to say, you know what, math's not for me, and I'm going to move on with the other millions of options that I have. And so I think people who don't get stuck very long are very good at navigating that tension, that you're constantly either saying yes to everything or you're only doing the thing that you're really good at. And figuring out how to bounce between those two is really important.
Yeah. Our mutual friend, David Epstein, who wrote that wonderful book, Range, makes a very similar argument about, he's making the argument that the best route to be truly great at something like sports is to have as broad a base as possible, is to do the Roger Federer thing, to play soccer and volleyball and whatever, a whole series of sports, and specialize as late in the game as possible. And the Tiger Woods model of playing golf since you were 3 is not the appropriate one for most people. Yeah. But I realize now, reading your book, I got a new perspective on why that's the right because athletes do get stuck. They plateau in terms of their skill. And unless you have a repertoire of kind of experiences that you built up, you have fewer options about how to get around that stuckness.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, for me, my first 6 months of grad school was all about one project. And I was pouring myself into this project. I figured that's what grad school was about. It was about becoming the world's expert in an area from day one. And after 6 months, we got an email to say, check out this paper, and it was basically the paper we were in the process of submitting. So all 6 months of that work had been for nothing. We weren't going to get to publish it. And so I started working with everyone. It's like, yes, I'll work with every faculty member that I can find for exactly that reason. But the thing I didn't realize at the time was how valuable it was to be exposed to 5 different ways of being an advisor and 5 different ways of being a professor and seeing the different ways they were doing everything. And their interests varied dramatically. I was just trying to protect myself from future stuckness and from spending all this time and energy doing something that would go nowhere. But I think that's what it did, is it kept my mind open to all these different approaches for as long as possible.
Yeah.
It was very useful.
But wait, you've described 2 instances from your own life where faced with a pretty serious obstacle, you were able to kind of change course and adapt and come out. Why, what is it about you? What I'm really wondering is, to what extent are some of these skills for dealing with this just an inherent part of who we are? Is there something about you that inherently that allows you to have done, I mean, you do, there's the actuarial thing where you're locked into did you have to give the money back? I
didn't, because I quit that day.
Oh, I see. If you keep going.
Yeah, if you keep going and then you quit later on, then you got to give it back.
So is that, and then just to be clear, for a grad student to learn that the thing that they have poured their heart and soul into for 6 months you've been beaten to the finish line by someone else, is a gut punch.
It is. It's called being scooped. It's the worst.
Yeah. So, but in both cases, you didn't crawl into a hole.
I did. I just didn't talk about that.
Oh, I see.
Then later on, I'm telling the smooth version of the story. But yeah, I mean, it was hard. It was hard at first. You got to deal with it and you figure out what you're going to do next. I figured that I'm very risk averse. I don't like taking big risks. And so I wanted to figure out how I could avoid these things that I didn't anticipate happening again, or some version of them. And so I figured if I thought I was going to love actuarial science, and then I didn't love actuarial science. And I didn't want to do something else without knowing that I would like it. So if I tried 50 different things, I would at least know what the alternatives were, and I could pick the best couple. And so I did psychology and law, which I loved, and I still love. And the same thing with being scooped. I didn't want to be scooped again. I was scooped many other times. I just had other things that were going on, so it wasn't as big a hit. But it was all just sort of a product of being risk averse. I don't think it was strategic. I didn't have a name for what I was doing. It just seemed like the right way to go.
Yeah. We're going to go to questions soon, but I just today had a very good example of a kind of strategy you talk about in your book. So I'm in the middle of doing my podcast season, and there was an episode that I have been working on kind of fitfully for a couple months now, and it just didn't work. It didn't work, and I've already done like 4 drafts. It just does not work, does it? But we have this tradition in podcasting where we do a table read, where you take whatever you've gotten, however bad shape it might be, and you gather together a group of people. One of the ones, we did a table read today where we just invited everyone in the office. There were like 20, 30 people in the room. And you just read it, as bad as it is, and then people comment. And it never ceases to amaze me how quickly you get unstuck when you expose what you're doing to a random group of people. They hadn't heard, I don't give them any background. I just, we play the tape and I read it. Just like a podcast episode, only it's live. I just read it, and then it's over, and I don't say anything, and I turn to them and I go, tell me what you think.
Yeah.
And, people say, some things people say are dumb, and the dumb things actually are incredibly useful. They're actually the most useful things.
Yeah.
And I don't really understand why, but it's in real time, you solve every problem that you had with it's the most astonishing. It's made me wonder, why doesn't everybody do this?
Yeah.
It's an amazing system.
You told me this a long time ago. We were running in Central Park, and you said, I was stuck on, I think, the last book.
Yeah.
And you said, just tell 12, 15 people about it. And I did. and it was better. It fixes it. It's amazing how bringing other people into your ideas improves them, especially if they're different from you.
Yeah.
They have different ideas, backgrounds, expertise.
Yeah.
It's an amazing unsticker.
And you realize, it's funny, because you realize that a lot of what you're stuck on are things that you falsely believe are central to your... So today, we read 2 today. There was a second one, which I thought was good. We did the table read, and I realized, not good. But they told me how to fix it. Yeah. And I realized one of the things I had loved about it was this episode about why is Silicon Valley in Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of it's like a Shaggy Dog story. Right. But it's like a really interesting thing, because like, if you actually dig into it, there's no reason for Silicon Valley to be in Northern California. Northern California there was nothing there in the 50s. It's just apricot trees. So like, what's going on? Why did everyone start making silicon chips in orchards, right? So we sort of dig into it. And I had fallen in love. The problem with this is I had fallen in love with this scene where this pivotal early guy in Silicon Valley goes around the world recruiting scientists. And it was all this tape of old guys talking about how he showed up in their lab, which I just thought was fantastic, because I love old guys. And everyone else is like, what's that? That's your problem. Oh, that's my problem.
Yeah.
In a million years, it would never have occurred to me that I was in love with the very thing that had ruined the episode.
It's impossible to get out of your own preferences, right? I mean, that's the other thing, is that even if you try really hard to imagine what your whole audience is thinking, when it's a thing that's for an audience, you can only imagine one person at a time. And the more different they are from you, the harder it is to do. So I think that's right. I think that's why you're trying to assemble a sort of micro version of the audience so they can react the way your audience will. And obviously your preferences will be idiosyncratic. You're not like everyone else.
But it's interesting that model, we're very used to that model for what we define culturally as pathologies. So if you go to an AA meeting, if you have an addiction to alcohol or drugs, we understand, that sharing your stories is incredibly powerful, moving. Or you go to group therapy if you have some serious... But we don't think of it for contexts that aren't obviously problematic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think, again, this is just for me, but I was historically very protective over my ideas. Like, I thought they were for me and I needed to tinker with them and figure them out, and then they were ready for prime time, and then I could share them. And so that's part of what I think it is. I think we think people will take our stuff and run with it, or that it won't be good enough, and so we've got to work on it till it gets to a 90 out of 100, not just a 70 out of 100. And I think that's where you make that mistake, that you've got to be a little bit vulnerable in sharing your ideas before they're really strong. And so I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, yeah.
But the interesting about the asymmetry, we do. But also that model goes against the grain, right? People are not comfortable sharing that stuff about themselves. It's taboo. And so you need a sort of structure that says this is what we do here, and you've got to share, and everyone shares. So I don't think it comes naturally to us.
Yeah.
It's a weird thing. We're a social species, but we don't like sharing all this. I
was a professional writer for 35 years before I understood the value of reading my stuff out loud to random groups of strangers. And if I had known that, early in my writing career, I really struggled with writing. And I realize now is because I didn't understand. All I had to do was expose it to other people, and they could fix problems for me. There's a moment in your book, there's a little fascinating line where you're talking about the value of diverse groups, and how diversity is useful even if when you're using diversity in the broadest possible.
Very broad,
Yeah, people who just think differently than you. It's useful even, and maybe even especially if the diverse people you're bringing in aren't very good.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence for that.
I just love that so much.
You want people who are less good but more different. You don't want people who are the same and good. So it's more important to have the difference. Don't worry about the ability, because as you said, often the stuff that's the gut reaction that's not particularly well thought through is really helpful at unsticking you.
Yeah.
That's what you're looking for, is those gut responses. And that's really hard to do yourself. You can't imagine what other people's gut responses will be.
And also sorry, we're digging into question time. This is my last comment, I promise. That maybe the part of what makes someone quote unquote good in that context is inhibiting them from giving you something useful. What you want is someone's, like I'm thinking of the table read we did today, what I really want is someone's unvarnished reaction. I don't want them to be a storytelling expert.
Yeah.
I want them just to be thinking as a listener, and
Yeah, and you want them to be, I don't know, your audiences are large and diverse themselves, but that's what you want to mirror as well, right?
Yeah.
So when people are listening to a podcast, they're not analyzing it deeply. They're probably doing the laundry or whatever else, or driving somewhere.
Yeah.
So that's what you want. You want the responses that are
Yeah.
those kinds of levels of engagement.
Yeah. Adam, we should do some questions while we have time. Sure.
I'm just having trouble with the luck component that
Sure.
you kept talking about, and I feel that I know in my life, when people, I had this amazing career for 12 years, and people would say, "Oh my God, how did you do?" I was a photo shoot producer, and I hired helicopters and lions, and flew around the world and took home my whole paycheck, and people just were so. They'd say, "I want to be your assistant. I want this," and I'd say, "Just do the work." Nobody handed anything. And when you talk about luck, I mean, yeah, did things line up for me? Yeah, they kind of did line up for me. But so when you talk about luck, I feel like there's this component of just pushing and working hard and trying to break through further and further. I mean, that was my objective and how I came to that position.
Right.
I was pushing. I was in film, I was in this, I was in that. But I didn't see, I felt like the piece, well, yes, of course luck was in there, but the piece to me that was more important in my career when people came to me and asked me those questions was the effort and the things I turned away and the things like you were talking about, I had to really focus and turn away a lot of, and I'd say to people, just reprioritize your life, focus on this one thing, and you will get to exactly where in your own version.
I think we're saying essentially the same thing. So I'm saying, and really what you're describing is a mirror of 3-4 chapters in the book, which is that you keep doing, you keep knowing when to say yes and when to say no, and that sounds like the kind of advice you gave people. And the luck comes as a consequence of that. It's not just that it's about luck just shaping all of our careers. The argument in the book is you've got to make it. It happens when you do certain things. So no one ever says, if someone came and said, "Tell me, how did you succeed in your career?" and you said it was just luck, it's kind of an empty, not very helpful response. But you could say, "I did these 7 things, and it turns out they brought me a lot of luck," if you wanted to describe it that way. And I think that's a more accurate description of what luck does. It sort of visits itself upon you when you create the right situations for it. And most of that is just doing things for enough time to allow that to happen.
Yeah, and
Sure.
turning
Oh, we should.
down great
Yeah,
things.
we should move on. We have limited time for questions
I
here.
think for most of the people, when they have achieved something in their life, they have gone through a process, the resources they have,
Right.
the network they have, they find and they get through it, kind of like similar to sense of achievement.
Right.
But are there like certain people who get stuck and unfortunately not having the right resources or not trying to process it properly at some point, they just like
Yes,
give up?
100%, yeah. I mean, I think there are people who give up strategically, and there are a lot of great books written about knowing when to quit and to move on. But I think there are a lot of people who are very frustrated in their stuckness, and that's what I found in this research I was doing, asking thousands of people for their experiences. A lot of them said, "I'm stuck, this is a really important thing to me. I would pay a huge portion of my assets to fix this problem. It feels very negative, I feel very alone. I need to figure out a way to fix it." And I read that enough times, I was like, well, science has a lot to say about this. So I think a lot of people are stuck, and with maybe some tools they could get unstuck. Yeah.
Sure.
I wanted to dig in a little further to this idea of explore and exploit.
Sure.
Because I've been noticing amongst my friend group, and I mean all industries, lawyers, people in finance and advertising, all of us around the age of 30, 31 are starting to have this wave of, I don't really want to do this anymore, and what do I do next?
Yeah.
And so you talked a bit about exploring when you're younger about what you want to do, and then exploring everything and then exploiting the one thing that you end up deciding that you like doing.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on this re-exploration period?
Yeah.
You're trying to figure out once again.
So this is not like you have one period in your life when you explore and then you exploit forever. It's about knowing when to switch between the two. So this research on hot streaks in people's careers and the most productive periods in our lives when we make the most progress in whatever's important to us, it's almost always after a period of exploring, then exploiting. So you can be 31, you can be any age and decide it's time to explore again. You have to be a little bit, you need certain conditions in place to be able to explore, but if you have them, it doesn't matter what age you're at. And I think it's always valuable to switch back into explore mode if you're not totally happy exploiting the thing you're exploiting. Yeah.
Sure.
COVID kind of stopped the world.
Yeah.
So for many people, that would be a time of breakthrough, yes or no.
Yeah.
There was a piece in the Times the other day, I'm sure you read it, the impact on students.
Yeah.
A long piece, haven't caught up yet. So how does that fit into all this when the world stopped in that spring of 2020?
Yeah, so that's when I wrote the proposal for the book and when I ended up writing the book, because I think for a lot of people there was, we had to there was a lot to come to grips with during that time. It was very hard on kids who were not able to go to school. There are some lags in educational attainment and things like that. But I think for a lot of people, paradoxically, that period when we were forced to make changes was, for some people at least, quite productive. They did something new or different. Again, I recognize that's not universal. For a lot of people, it was just a tremendously difficult time. But for a lot of people, they started businesses, they had career shifts, they figured out new ways to organize their lives around commuting versus doing things online. I think it had a really big unsticking effect for a lot of people. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but I think for a lot of people who wouldn't have anticipated it when it became a source of hardship in March 2020, within a few months they'd figured out a way to use it to their advantage as an unsticking tool.
Sure.
When you were talking about Einstein, it reminded me of an article on age and the brain.
Yeah.
They were saying how younger, up until 37 or something, their brains are innovative and they've got like great memory and recall. Then they become more synthetic as they get older. So people presumably get wiser, right? So
Yeah.
have you found a correlation? Do people get unstuck when they get wiser or older, or do just as many people like double down on maladaptive strategies?
They do. I think they do. And if you look at the age at which the most successful business people, men and women, start businesses, it's in their mid-40s and into their 50s and 60s, which I think a lot of people find a little surprising, because a lot of what we see as the canonical story of the prodigy is really interesting. The 22-year-old who dropped out of college and started a tech company. Actually, that's incredibly rare, and a lot of what makes those people successful is the experiences they've had, and I think it's also that shift to being a little more resilient, and maybe you don't have the mental acuity. We know there's a little bit of that's lost over time, but you have a lot of other things that I think more than make up for it in a lot of domains. So yes, I think that makes older people in many ways better at unsticking. And I think the value of experience is tremendous for unsticking in general. Yeah.
Way in the back. Yeah.
You mentioned there's a lot of value when you bring in people who might not be as good but are different.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how do you institutionalize that? What I mean is let's say you're a team of engineers,
Mm-hmm.
you're looking to bring somebody on. By that logic, maybe it makes sense to hire somebody who's a writer instead of another engineer. Because they're
Yeah.
not good at engineering, but they're different. And if you're in that position, how do you become comfortable taking the risk that bringing somebody with a diversity of thought might end up being better if you have to solve a problem? You know what I'm saying?
I do, yeah. I think it depends a lot on how technical the field is. There are some fields that are so technical that you need a certain minimum level of understanding. I don't know exactly what kind of engineering you're doing, but maybe a writer couldn't reach that level, the average writer. If they can, though, I remembered, and this still happens at NYU, if you look at the way companies come to recruit, they don't just go down the list of everyone studying exactly what they do. A lot of the very good companies, the very strong ones, will come in and say, I want 5 people doing Russian literature, and I want 3 people doing organic chemistry, and I want 4 mathematicians. And I think that's for that very reason, that as long as you can learn on the job, it's not so technical that you need training, huge amounts of training for it. You just want people with different backgrounds. Obviously, you're not going out looking for people who are less talented, right? That's just sort of to make the strong case for the argument for having diverse thought. But I think the diverse part is absolutely critical. And to the extent that you can bring in people who are writers and other things, as long as they can get over that first initial hurdle, I think there's huge value there.
Yeah. How much time do we have? Who's in charge? It's not me. My watch is not accurate.
How much time? Whenever you're ready.
Should we do 2 more questions? Is that okay?
Longer, please do, but it's
2 more questions.
wrap shortly.
Yeah, okay. Right there.
Hi. Question for the top of the thing. When does it matter most and how do you know that it matters most?
What thing are we talking about?
Top of your thing, it says how to get unstuck when it matters most.
Oh,
Now, when does it matter?
it's up to you. That's sort of. It's when you say, I really want to get unstuck, then it matters most. Yeah. So it's really just, that's sort of to make the case for.
All right, last question. How about over there in the corner?
Hi.
So, lock and unstuck, but conversely, what about inspiration? You know, I mean, the way I see it, there's sort of two types of inspiration. There's, you know, being inspired by a new book or going
Sure.
to a museum, and then there's what is a gift of inspiration that comes out of the ethers and falls in your lap, and that we can't control.
Yeah.
I don't know anyone that can control that, and that I feel like that plays a huge role.
Yeah.
Whether someone is, you know, it takes you out of being unstuck, and it just carries you.
Yeah.
And but we can't control it. We have to wait for that.
So there are
But
two.
it affects everyone's life that I know.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So there are two ways of thinking about being creative. One of them is this inspiration lens, and the other one is the hard work lens. And they're both true. The inspiration lens says good ideas just fall on some people have more of them than others. The production lens says the harder you try, the more time you spend, the more creative you'll be. There are lots of people who are not that creative innately, who do the hard work, and they push up against the struggles that come with not having good ideas, and good ideas often come. But there are, as with anything, there are always going to be individual differences in that. But what's striking is how many people, they look at the variance across people and within people, and if you've had a good night's sleep, you will be, the difference between how creative you'll be dwarfs any long-term differences in how creative different people are. So the most important thing is that you are at your creative best, rather than that you are a particularly creative person. So that in trying to decouple those, it seems like you at your best are, or one at his or her best is as good as anyone, basically. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. And Adam is going to sign. Are you signing?
They're already signed.
There's books for sale out there. Do not leave without one. And if you want to buy more than one, like 4 or 5, that's totally fine. If you want to read it more than once, then buy 2, right? But thank you all for coming.